thought I saw a putty cat.
Yosemite Sam! It's Yosemite Sam!
Yosemite Sam!
Yosemite! Yeah, Yosemite Sam!
This is the man who gave us Yosemite Sam, the man who put Sylvester and Tweety together and walked away with an Academy Award, one of the directors who defined what a Looney Tune was. And yet, he built this after Warner Brothers shut the lights off. So here's the pattern of the series so far. So almost every director in this after the Looney Tunes series I've done is a story about loss. Tex Avery built the absolute pinnacle of comedy animation, and then he got discarded by the industry, shuffling off to make Saturday morning cartoons at Hanna-Barbera. Bob McKimson had the same fate, but he just kept on working until he passed away. Chuck Jones ended up running a small production outfit making cartoons for other studios. The theatrical short was dying, but what do you do when the one thing you mastered becomes more or less obsolete? Friz Freleng answered that question differently than anyone else. He didn't get smaller, he actually built an empire. This video is about the fact that out of every director that walked out of Warner Brothers Animation, Friz Freleng is the only one who turned the end of the studio era into a business he actually owned and was quite successful. He has a studio with his very name on the door, and even a contract from his old bosses too. But to understand how, you have to go back to the very beginning, because Friz was never really the junior man in the room. So Friz wasn't a guy who became important at Warner Brothers, he was important from the start. When Leon Schlesinger opened up his studio in 1933 after his contract with Harmonizing was terminated, Friz was already the senior man, the director whose sense of musical timing basically defined what a Warner Brothers cartoon felt like. And here's a detail most people skip over. In 1938, Friz actually left. He walked away from Schlesinger to go direct at MGM because, hey, they were paying more. So why not? If you can get paid more doing what you love, why wouldn't you go? And he was working on The Captain and the Kids. He hated it. And he came straight back to Warner Brothers almost as fast as he had gone. In fact, if you watch the short You Ought to Be in Pictures, that was more or less Friz's tribute to Leon Schlesinger and thanking him for letting him come back. Now, I can't really prove the next part, so this is just me thinking out loud here, but he had been at Schlesinger's, but then Schlesinger stole the studio to Warner Brothers, so he had seen the Warner Brothers operation and how the animation units were run. But when he was at MGM, he saw how he felt it was badly run. So I would imagine that sort of information would have been in the back of his mind when he opened up his own studio later. As I said, that was just speculation. By the early 1960s, the ground under the theatrical cartoon was already shifting. Warner Brothers Animation, as far as theatricals went, that was slowly dying off. Television was king, and by this point, the animated shorts had been playing on television through the Bugs Bunny show and other outlets. And Friz had been in the industry long enough to know that things were changing. So when the end came, I don't feel like he was blindsided, but as with anyone, he still had to work. So in 1963, Warner Brothers winds down his animation operation entirely. The building goes quiet, and the most important cartoon studio, arguably, some might argue it's Disney, but anyway, but it just stops. And just before the end though, you can just tell that Friz's brain was kind of restless because there was a pilot that he made. It was called Filbert, that was released in 1961, and in mixed live action and animation, the pilot was never picked up, but you can see the TV pilots available online. Now, mixing live action and animation was certainly not new. Walt Disney was doing it way back in the silent era with the Alice comedies, and there were a few shorts here and there, particularly from Tex Avery, where you would have some live action mixed around animation. So Friz Freleng didn't invent anything with Filbert, but it does tell you something about him that while the theatrical short was on its way out, Friz was trying out new things. A lot of you may think he went straight to creating DePatie-Freleng, but that's actually not the case. His first stop after Warner Brothers was actually Hanna-Barbera, and on the surface it looks like the exact same move everyone else made, so the old theatrical guys ending up at a TV studio. In fact, if you look at a lot of the Golden Age animators, writers, and other artists, a lot of them actually did end up going over to Hanna-Barbera or the various other studios that were starting up to do television animation. But he was actually brought in for Hey There, It's Yogi Bear, which was a feature based on the wildly successful Yogi Bear series that Hanna-Barbera did. So even though Friz ended up at Hanna-Barbera, it's interesting that he was still working in theatricals of a sort, though it was much larger than what he had actually done before. Now, he didn't actually end up directing Hey There, It's Yogi Bear. But while he was on the production of that, he actually did something rather interesting. So meet David DePatie. David DePatie wasn't some executive. He was the last producer of Warner Brothers Animation, and essentially the guy that turned out the lights at the very studio that Friz Freleng built his career on. So you have the final Warner Brothers Animation producer and one of its defining directors teaming up on their own the moment the door closed behind them. And they don't go looking for jobs. They actually start a company, DePatie-Freleng Enterprises. And in a detail I love, they immediately start making theatrical shorts. And one of those jobs is for Warner Brothers. The same Warner Brothers that had just closed its own animation studio is now contracting the work back out to the man who used to run it. So yes, Warner's shows Friz the door, and within a couple of years, they're paying him to make their cartoons. So the employee becomes the vendor. But here's what's interesting. So this is what made this whole thing pay off. Director Blake Edwards needs an animated title sequence for a live-action comedy ensemble starring David Niven and Peter Sellers. He hires DFE for one of their very first jobs. And side note, one of the highlights of the 1960s when it comes to movies is that plenty of movies have animated opening titles. And a lot of those were done by people who used to work on Golden Age theatricals. And the Pink Panther is probably one of the most famous examples. So Friz Freleng and his brilliant layout artist that came over with him, Hawley Pratt, they end up designing a character, a cool, silent pink cat, the Pink Panther. Because in the movie it's about a diamond, but here they just take it literally. But we're all glad for that. It's such a wonderful, appealing design. And while the Pink Panther movies are great, they're wonderful to see. If you haven't seen them, definitely do so. At least the ones where Peter Sellers is alive. But the Pink Panther ends up becoming somewhat bigger than the movie, and it ended up spinning off into a series of its own theatrical shorts. While the theatrical shorts were dying off, the Pink Panther ended up ushering in a different era of theatrical shorts. And so the very first Pink Panther short is the Pink Fink. And not only did it make such a big impression and help launch this theatrical series, which again spun off the actual animated title cards, it also won Friz another Oscar. But unlike at Warner Brothers, where the producer at Warner Brothers was the one picking up the Oscar, in this case, Friz Freleng, being a producer, he was able to pick up the Oscar himself. And while this would be the only Oscar that DePatie-Freleng would have, it was still a pretty strong statement, and this scrappy new studio had proven that it was a new force in the industry. So as I mentioned before, DePatie-Freleng would take on a contract to do new Looney Tunes cartoons, for better or worse. That's another topic entirely. I have done another video covering the DePatie-Freleng era of the Warner Brothers cartoons, so definitely check that out if you haven't. If anything, I've long suspected that that was just a quickie job for them, and they were really more focused on the Pink Panther and all of the other animated cartoons that they were doing around the time. DePatie-Freleng became a machine. And in the beginning, Friz actually did direct some of the projects, but not long after, Friz ended up mostly just producing, and he was steering the operation rather than directing every time himself, and the range is the whole point. So we had other theatrical series that followed the Pink Panther's footprint. So you had the Inspector. So think of that as like the spin-off of the spin-off, because it was the Inspector being first a side character in the first Pink Panther movie, and then being the main character in all the subsequent ones until Peter Sellers' death. But you also had things like the Tijuana Toads. You had some Dr. Seuss specials, which have since turned into holiday staples. While a lot of people think, yes, The Grinch Who Stole Christmas is one of the best ever made, the DePatie-Freleng entries were certainly not far behind. And yes, they were also even doing television. So you had on one end, television shows, you had prestige Dr. Seuss specials on the other end, and then you had the theatricals in the middle. In fact, DePatie-Freleng would be one of the last studios doing dedicated theatrical shorts for the theatre. The other one being Walter Lantz Studios, as they were still churning out the Woody Woodpecker shorts for better or worse in this period. And here's something I didn't want to gloss over as well, because it's very Friz. If you've been watching the single reviews I've been doing on the channel, you'll notice a lot of the shorts that Friz Freleng would do over the years, he would end up reusing a lot of gags, but he tended to improve on a lot of that. Once these DePatie-Freleng shorts were made, a lot of these weren't actually built from scratch. A lot of them were actually remakes, or they just used a lot of gags and setups straight out from the Warner Brothers shorts that Friz himself had directed before. The man knew what worked. He owned the instincts, and he wasn't precious about reusing them. No one binge-watched these things back in the day, so it made complete sense. And none of that is a knock either. If anything, as I said, he tended to improve on gags if he ever reused them. But this was one of the ways that the DePatie-Freleng was actually a very efficient machine. Friz was right at the top, running the place that had made them. But in the mid-1970s, Warner Brothers actually came calling again. So the Looney Tunes property had become somewhat dormant in the early 1970s, The property had sputtered out, but Warner Brothers calls not only Chuck Jones to do a few projects, they also contact Friz Freleng, and they want new Looney Tunes content, and Friz says yes, and he delivers. New television specials built around the classic characters, so you have a Bugs Bunny Christmas special, you have a Daffy Duck Easter special, not clip packages cobbled out of old footage, new framing, new animated material, so Friz directing Bugs and Daffy and the gang, again, decades on. And this is kind of the full circle, so the director that left Warner Brothers comes back, but the power had actually flipped. Friz now co-owns a studio, he doesn't have to do this work, but he does. And just when you think you've mapped the range of this studio, theatrical shorts, Saturday mornings, prestige Seuss specials, you find this. In 1977, a little science fiction movie called Star Wars needed someone to make its laser swords actually glow on screen. And the studio they turned to? DePatie-Freleng. The lightsaber, one of the most iconic visual effects in film history, was brought to life by the animation house that Friz Freleng built. So the same studio cranking out Pink Panther shorts and Saturday morning cartoons also put the glow on Luke Skywalker's lightsaber. Or sorry, Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber. Don't want to upset the Star Wars fans here, but that's not a studio scraping by. That's a studio everyone in Hollywood knew to call when they needed something like this to be done. So here's the thing a lot of people get wrong about the end of DePatie-Freleng. The studio gets sold to Marvel, and people assume that, oh, it must have been a failure, that's why a bigger company ended up buying them out. In this case, it was actually the opposite. The sale happened because DePatie-Freleng Enterprises was working too well, and because Friz got an offer he just could not turn down. In 1980, Warner Brothers did something nobody expected. They reopened their animation department, and they wanted Friz to produce and direct a new run of compilation features. Now think about what that offer actually is. The studio that let him walk in '63 is asking him to come back home and direct Bugs Bunny again. And he said yes. And that is actually the real catalyst for the sale. Friz Freleng was leaving, but the studio he left behind wasn't some burnt out shell. By the late 1970s, DePatie-Freleng Enterprises had moved deep into television, and they had been working directly with Marvel Comics, producing superhero shows like the New Fantastic Four in 1978 and Spider-Woman in 1979. So look at the position Marvel's in. They've got a comic empire full of characters, they want cartoons made out of them, and they're already paying this studio to do exactly that. Why keep renting the factory when you can just buy it? And so on June 19, 1980, Marvel Comics, then owned by Candence Industries, bought DePatie-Freleng outright. Not to strip it for parts, but to bring animation in-house and build full-scale series out of their own superheroes. And here's the detail that proves the studio was never the problem. Marvel didn't gut the place, they kept the staff, they kept the facilities, and David DePatie, the other half of DePatie-Freleng Enterprises, stayed on, and he became the head of the newly rebranded Marvel Productions. Heck, they even animated another Pink Panther intro title. So untangled what actually happened, so the studio didn't collapse, one partner, Friz, leaves at the top to go direct Looney Tunes again, the other partner, DePatie, doesn't get shown the door, he gets handed the keys to Marvel Animation Studio. Nobody loses. That's not a studio dying. That's two different creators cashing in on almost 2 decades of success. And Friz was still not done. He directs a run of theatrical compilation cartoon films for Warner Brothers. The Looney Bugs Bunny movie, Bugs Bunny's 1001 Rabbit Tales, and Daffy Duck's Fantastic Island. While those did reuse the older shorts, he ended up directing new framing material around these, and this also allowed a new generation of people to enjoy the theatrical shorts on the big screen as they're meant to be seen. And it's a bit of a victory lap for him, so the format that died in the 1960s, and here's Friz, decades later, still putting Bugs Bunny back in the movie theater. So in 1986, Friz Freleng steps back from directing. He does stay on as a consultant, so he's like the institutional memory.
I'm Friz Freleng. And you're watching the Cartoon Network.
And in 1995, he passes away aged 89. And a side note, one of the tributes to Friz Freleng was the Sylvester and Tweety mysteries, which premiered after his death, and this is why you see a tribute to him in their credits. The premise of this whole series is what happens to the directors after they leave Warner Brothers, whether on their own or if they were forced to. And almost every answer has been a version of decline. Friz Freleng is exception because he had the same setback as everyone else, and yet he bet on himself and he started a company with David DePatie, and he ended up co-designing a character that outgrew the movie that it was made for. He built an operation that worked every corner of the business at once, and he put Bugs Bunny back on the screen on his own terms later on as well, even though he didn't really have to. So essentially, this is the story of a director surviving the end of an era. The story of one man who looked at the end of Looney Tunes and saw an opening. And next in this series, the most chaotic talent the studio ever produced, Bob Clampett. And after that, Frank Tashlin, who took everything he learned drawing cartoons and walked it straight into live-action Hollywood. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss them.